Fire me, you'll regret it. My daughter said right before she found out I own the hospital. Sign it, Margaret said, and she slid the termination letter across the break room table like she was closing a business deal instead of ending her father's career. 31 years, and this is what it comes down to, she said. You're done here. Effective today. I looked up at my daughter standing over me in her white coat with her hospital badge that said, Dr. Margaret Voss, Chief of Staff, and I did not reach for the pen. Behind her, 11 other people stood in that break room in their scrubs and their lab coats, watching. Somebody's coffee mug was still steaming on the counter. Nobody moved to pick it up. Is this really what you want? I asked her. She did not blink. You've been coasting on a name that isn't even yours anymore, Dad. You're a security guard. You check badges at a door. That's not a career, that's charity. And I'm done pretending otherwise in front of the board. The room went so quiet I could hear the HVAC system cycling somewhere in the ceiling. Before I tell you how we got to that break room, let me back up. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 66 years old, and 3 months before that morning, I was still doing what I'd done for 11 straight years, which was arrive at Meridian General Hospital in Scranton, Pennsylvania, at 5:15 in the morning, badge myself through the East employee entrance, and stand at the front security desk in a Navy uniform that said Kessler over the breast pocket, checking IDs and waving in nurses who'd worked 12-hour shifts and looked like they wanted to lie down in the parking lot. I want to tell you about my father first, because none of what happened at that hospital makes sense without him. My father, Elias Kessler, came to Scranton in 1968 with a suitcase, a nursing degree from a program that barely still exists, and $40 folded into his sock. He worked the coal country clinics for a decade before he scraped together enough, borrowed the rest from a credit union that doesn't exist anymore either, and bought a run-down 11-bed clinic on the edge of town that the county was ready to condemn. He didn't buy it because he saw money in it. He bought it because he'd watched 3 men die in a waiting room chair, because the nearest real hospital was 40 minutes away on icy roads, and he decided that wasn't going to keep happening if he had anything to say about it. I grew up in the back rooms of that clinic. I learned to read in a supply closet. By the time I was 20, my father had grown it to 60 beds and renamed it Meridian General. By the time he died, heart attack, on shift, in the hallway outside the ICU, at 74 years old, because the man refused to retire it, was 410 beds, a level 2 trauma center, a cancer wing, and the largest employer in 3 counties. He left it to me. All of it. Quietly incorporated under a holding company called Kessler Regional Health, decades before anyone thought to ask questions, because my father had learned the same hard lesson I would later learn myself. The moment people know what you have, they stop seeing you and start seeing a number. That lesson had a name and a face, and his name was Bill Dorner. Bill and I grew up 2 streets apart. We played baseball together till we were 17. In my 30s, flushed with the hospital doing well for the first time under my ownership, I told him everything over beers at a bar that's now a nail salon. 3 weeks later, he was in my office with a proposal to buy the old radiology building and flip it to a developer, telling me my own father had promised it to him before he died. My father had never met the man. I asked him to leave and never spoke to him again. That night I made myself a rule I never broke for 30 years. Nobody finds out what you own until you decide they need to know. Not friends, not neighbors, not my own children. I told myself I was protecting them. It took me 3 decades and 1 very bad morning in a break room to admit I was protecting myself. I married Ruth Ann the spring I turned 29. She was 24, worked the reception desk at the very clinic my father built, and had a laugh that made grown men in that waiting room forget they were scared. We built a life together in a house. I framed myself 2 summers running, and we had 2 children, Margaret first, then her brother Daniel 3 years behind her. I promised Ruth Ann, the winter Margaret turned 25, that when she hit 30 I'd sit her down and tell her everything. 30 came. She was deep in her residency, exhausted, and I thought, not yet, let her breathe. 35 came. She was married to a man named Preston Cole and building a name for herself as a rising administrator. And I thought, she's finding her footing. It'll keep. She turned 41 the week everything broke apart, and somewhere in those 11 years, the window I kept promising myself had quietly closed, and I hadn't noticed until it was gone. Here is the thing about Preston Cole that I want you to understand, because he is the reason any of this happened at all. Preston did not fall into my daughter's life by accident. Preston had spent almost 20 years building a very specific kind of career hospital administrator, always brought in during transitional periods, always the outside expert hired to modernize aging institutions. 3 different hospital systems in 3 different states had brought him in over 2 decades. Hollis Ward, my attorney of 31 years, did the digging I should have done the day I met the man. 2 of those 3 hospitals sold to private equity groups within 18 months of Preston's arrival. The third went into a management buyout that conveniently benefited a consulting firm Preston had a financial stake in. He was good at what he did. What he did was find hospitals with confused ownership structures, aging founders, and grown children hungry to prove themselves, and he inserted himself directly into the gap between generations. He met Margaret at a healthcare conference in Pittsburgh 9 years ago, married her within 14 months, and the very first Thanksgiving he sat at my table, he asked me 3 questions about the hospital, smooth as anything, the way a man does when he's confirming something he already half suspects. You've worked security there a long time, Walter. First time. Beautiful old building, that east wing. Second time. Margaret says you know every hallway in that place better than the administrators do. Third time. I answered him plainly each time. A long time. It has some history. I get around. My son Daniel, younger than Margaret by 3 years, a paramedic working out of Wilkes-Barre who I hadn't seen enough of in recent years, pulled me aside in the driveway that night. "Dad, I don't like him," he said. "He asked me 2 questions tonight, both about you specifically, not about the family. You." It felt like a background check. Daniel had his mother's read on people, and in 30 years he had never once been wrong about someone that mattered. "I'll keep an eye on it," I told him. I did not keep enough of an eye on it. That was the first mistake of many that season, and it was not the last. 3 years ago, Hollis called me into his office, not a phone call, in person, which, from Hollis, always meant something serious. "Someone has been quietly digging into the ownership structure of Kessler Regional Health," he told me. "Private research, public filings, attempts to access records that shouldn't have been accessible. It traces to a consulting firm out of Philadelphia. The listed client is Preston Cole. There's a document already drafted, Walter. A transfer agreement. Your name is already typed into the signature block. The date is blank." I sat in that office and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. "How long?" I asked. 8 months, minimum," Hollis said. "This wasn't an impulse. This was a plan with a calendar. There was more. Preston had been quietly meeting with a hospital management conglomerate out of Philadelphia called Ashcroft Health Partners, feeding them internal occupancy data, staffing costs, and revenue projections information he had no authority to share, because on paper, Preston Cole had no ownership stake in Meridian General at all. He was simply the chief administrative officer, married to the woman everyone assumed would eventually inherit whatever there was to inherit. "I want to wait," I told Hollis. "I need to know if my daughter walked into this with her eyes open, or if Preston walked her in with the lights off. Those are 2 very different things, and I won't treat them the same until I know which one it is." What I did not know then, what I would not learn until much later, was that 6 months before Hollis found that drafted document, I had made a call myself that handed Preston exactly the tool he needed. Margaret had been drifting for years, restless in her career, watching younger doctors get administrative titles she felt she deserved. I called the hospital board my own board, appointed by me, though none of them knew that the quiet majority shareholder behind Kessler Regional Health was the security guard who badged them in every morning, and I told them to give my daughter a real shot, chief of staff. Let her prove herself. They said yes. Of course they said yes. I was the man who signed their checks, even if they didn't know my face on the org chart. What I hadn't understood was that Preston had already been positioning himself to use Margaret as his instrument, and my one phone call simply handed him the leverage with the handle already pointed his direction. The day Margaret became chief of staff, I drove to the hospital at 5:15 the way I did every morning, badged through the east entrance, and stood at my post while my daughter walked past me in a new blazer, chin up, without so much as a glance in my direction. She had not looked at me really, looked at me in longer than I wanted to count. 3 weeks after her promotion, My son Daniel called me from an ambulance bay in Wilkes-Barre. "Dad, can I ask you something? 2 years ago, I put in for a paramedic supervisor position at Meridian's EMS division. Never heard back, not even a rejection. Did you know about that?" "I found out after the fact," I told him. "And I'm sorry, son. That never should have happened." He was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," he finally said, in the tone that means it is not okay, but he's choosing not to push it further. I sat in my truck in the hospital parking lot after that call and understood, all at once, that the thing I'd built to protect my children had spent years quietly setting them against each other, without my ever intending it, simply because I would not speak. That night, Ruth Ann was waiting at the kitchen table when I came home, a cup of tea gone cold in front of her the way it did when her mind was somewhere else entirely. She looked at me and said, "Tell me about your father. Tonight I want the whole story from the beginning, because tomorrow you're walking back into that hospital, and I need to understand exactly what you're walking into." I told her everything, start to finish, sitting at that table until nearly midnight. When I finished, she reached across and put both her hands over mine. "Walter," she said, "you have been protecting yourself from a mistake you already made 30 years ago and calling it protection for them. It's time." "Tomorrow," she said. It was not a threat. It was the sound of a woman who had run out of road to give me. I did not sleep that night. At 4 in the morning I got up, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs. By the back door hung my father's old stethoscope, mounted in a shadow box Ruth Ann had made years ago, not because I used it. I hadn't practiced medicine a day in my life, but because it was the only thing of his I had left that he'd actually touched with his own hands during 30 years of shifts. I took it down and put it in my coat pocket, the way some men carry a pocket knife or a coin. It had been my habit for 20 years, on the mornings that mattered. I drove to the hospital before dawn, parked in the employee lot the way I always did, and stood at my post at 5:15 sharp, watching the sun come up gray behind the parking structure. I did my job. I checked badges. I said good morning to nurses coming off overnight shifts who looked like they wanted to lie down right there on the sidewalk. And I waited, because Hollis had told me the transfer document had reappeared, and I had a strong feeling that whatever Preston was planning, he was not planning to wait much longer either. He wasn't. That very afternoon, the hospital held a reception in the East Wing atrium to celebrate the opening of a newly renovated pediatric unit, a project Margaret had spearheaded as her first major initiative as chief of staff. Board members were there. City council members were there. A reporter from the Scranton Times-Tribune was there with a photographer. There were nearly 200 people in that atrium: donors, physicians, hospital staff, community leaders, all gathered under a banner that said, "Meridian General, building the next 50 years. I was there too, in uniform, working the east entrance the way I always did, at hospital events, checking credentials as guests filed in. I want you to understand, I could have called in sick that day. Some part of me almost did. But another part of me, the part that had spent 30 years watching my father's building from the inside, needed to see with my own eyes what Preston was going to do. Preston found me an hour into the reception, working the door near the coat check, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "Walter," he said, warm as anything. "Good to see you here. Big day for Margaret." "It is," I said. "I wanted to catch you for a minute," he said, "while things are calm. Just a small piece of housekeeping. Really a document to formalize the administrative structure going forward, make things cleaner for Margaret's role." He opened the portfolio to the first page and held it out. "Just needs a signature, and we're done." I did not take it right away. I looked at the page in his hands, my name typed in a signature block near the bottom, the date line conspicuously blank, exactly the way Hollis had described it. "I need to read this carefully," I told him. "Of course," he said, smiling the smile of a man who has said this exact sentence 100 times before, in other buildings, in other cities, to other confused older men standing at other doors. "But don't take too long, Walter. It's a celebration. No sense letting paperwork slow things down." He walked off toward the crowd, unhurried, easy, a man who owned the room, even though he did not own a single brick of it. I stood there at the coat check with that folder in my hands for a long moment. Then I did something I had never once done in 11 years standing at that post. I walked away from my station, into the atrium, toward my daughter. Margaret was near the podium, laughing at something a board member had said, radiant in the way she used to be before all this, before Preston, before the distance. "I want you to know something," I said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. "I need you to come with me for 5 minutes. It's important." She glanced past me, saw the crowd, saw the reporter with his camera raised toward the pediatric unit's ribbon cutting, and her face tightened with something between annoyance and embarrassment. "Dad, not now. This is not the day. It has to be now," I said. She sighed the sigh of a woman who has spent years being patient with a father she has decided is set in his ways, and followed me to a break room just off the atrium, the same break room where, I promise you, everything came to a head about 20 minutes later. I set the folder on the table between us and opened it to the signature page. "Do you know what this is?" I asked her. "Preston mentioned something about updating the administrative bylaws," she said. "It's routine. I need you to sign wherever he needs you to sign, Dad. It's a formality." I read it out loud to her, the actual language, slow and clear, the way I used to read maintenance reports at 5 in the morning to no one but myself. "The transferring party, that's me, Margaret, agrees to relinquish all ownership interests in Kessler Regional Health, including Meridian General Hospital, and all subsidiary holdings, to Margaret Kessler Cole and Preston Andrew Cole, jointly." Margaret went very still. "Jointly," she repeated. "Not just me? Jointly," I said. "To you and your husband both." I watched something shift behind my daughter's eyes, not disbelief exactly, more the look of a woman running back through 100 small conversations from the last 2 years and hearing them differently for the first time. "Dad," she said slowly, "what ownership interests? You're a security guard." There was a knock at the door. It was Preston, and behind him, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway, board members, a few nurses, and yes, the reporter, drawn by the sense that something in that break room was more interesting than a ribbon cutting. Preston stepped inside, saw the folder open on the table, and his easy smile flickered for just a fraction of a second before he rebuilt it. "Everything all right in here?" he said. Margaret turned to him. "Preston, what is this document? What ownership interests is my father supposedly transferring?" For a moment, Preston's face did something I hadn't seen it do in 9 years of knowing him, a flicker of pure, uncalculated surprise, quickly buried. He recovered fast. "Sweetheart," he said, "your father has been quietly holding a controlling interest in the hospital's parent company for years. I've been trying to help you get what's rightfully yours. It's time he stepped back and let the two of us run things properly." That is when Margaret turned to me, and that is when she said the words that had been sitting in her, unknowingly aimed at the wrong target for longer than either of us understood. "You've been coasting on a name that isn't even yours anymore, Dad. You're a security guard. You check badges at a door. Sign it. You're done here. Effective today." The room had filled up behind Preston by then. 11, 12 people, more crowding the hallway. Somebody's coffee mug sat steaming on the counter, forgotten. I did not raise my voice. I picked the folder up off the table, not the pen she'd slid toward me, the folder itself, and I turned to the small crowd gathered at the door. "My name is Walter Kessler," I said. "Some of you may not know that name. I want to read you what this document says, out loud, so there's no confusion later about what almost happened here today." I read it slow, the way my father used to read patient charts, unhurried, letting every word land. When I got to the number, because Hollis had insisted on including the valuation, 410 beds, a level 2 trauma center, 30 years of expansion, appraised at $162 million. I heard someone in the hallway actually gasp. Margaret's face had gone the color of the wall behind her. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "What did you just say?" Before I could answer, the door pushed open again, and Hollis Ward walked in, calfskin briefcase in one hand, the unhurried gait of a man who had done this exact walk in his head 100 times while he waited for the call. I'd told him that morning before my shift started to be within 10 minutes of the hospital and to keep his phone on. He'd known this day might come faster than either of us expected. "Mr. Kessler," he said to me, formal in front of the crowd the way he'd been for 31 years, "is now a good time?" "It's exactly the time," I said. Hollis set his briefcase on the counter and opened it. "For those who don't know me," he said to the room, My name is Hollis Ward. I have served as legal counsel for Kessler Regional Health for 31 years. He turned to Preston. Mr. Cole, before anything further happens in this room, I want to clarify a few facts for everyone present. He laid out a document on the counter, and the room leaned in without quite meaning to. Kessler Regional Health was founded by Elias Kessler in 1968 and passed by will to his son, Walter Kessler, in 1994, a probate that cleared without contest because there was no one positioned to contest it. Walter Kessler has been sole owner and controlling shareholder of the parent company ever since, including, for the past 11 years, while working a security position at this hospital under the same name he was born with, for reasons of his own that are frankly no one's business but his family's. He set a second page down, the Ashcroft Health Partners letterhead visible from across the room. Mr. Cole, in his role as an administrator with no ownership stake and no authority to negotiate on behalf of Kessler Regional Health, entered into preliminary discussions with a private equity health partnership 6 weeks ago regarding the potential sale of this hospital system. He represented himself as having the authority to do so. He does not have that authority. He never has. I watched Margaret's face while Hollis spoke, and I want to tell you honestly, it was one of the hardest things I've had to watch in 66 years, because I could see the exact moment the math started running behind her eyes, every conversation with Preston resorting itself into a different order. Preston's composure finally cracked. "This is a family matter," he said, his voice losing its warmth for the first time. "It doesn't need to be handled in front of a reporter. It's my professional matter," Hollis said evenly, "since I represent Kessler Regional Health, and Mr. Cole's conduct using confidential hospital data to pursue an unauthorized sale constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and potential tortious interference under Pennsylvania law. I'll be filing the relevant documentation with the court Monday morning." Margaret turned to her husband slowly. "Did you know?" she said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "You sat at my father's table every Thanksgiving for 9 years. You asked him questions about the hospital. Did you know the whole time?" Preston did not answer her, and in a room full of people, his silence answered for him. That is when Daniel walked in. My son had been in the atrium the whole time, having driven up from Wilkes-Barre for his sister's ribbon cutting, and someone in the hallway had pulled him in to see what the commotion was about. He looked at his sister, at me, at the folder still open on the table, and something in him that had been sitting quietly for years finally came loose. "Do you know," he said, his voice shaking, "that I've been putting $100 in an envelope and mailing it to Dad every month for 4 years, because I thought he was struggling on a security guard's salary. 4 years, Margaret, because I thought he needed it. And you had access to everything, and you never once asked why he was working a door at 66 years old." Margaret's hand came up to her mouth. "I didn't know," she said. "Dad, I swear to you, I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," I said. "And that's exactly the problem I created. I let you not know. That's on me, not just on him." I looked around that break room at the coffee mug still steaming, at the reporter writing fast in a small notebook, at the nurses in the doorway who had known me for 11 years as the quiet man at the east entrance, who remembered everyone's name and never once mentioned that his father built the building they worked in. I looked at Preston, whose leather portfolio was still under his arm, whose whole plan had just come apart in a break room instead of a boardroom. "Your position here is terminated, effective today," I told him. "Mr. Ward has the paperwork." He turned without a word and walked out, and nobody in that room tried to stop him or say goodbye. Then I turned to Margaret. "I'm not angry at you," I told her. "I built the wall between us. I don't blame you for standing on the side of it I put you on." I went home that night and I didn't sleep. Not from anger, but from something more like relief, finally finding room to move through me. Ruth Ann sat with me at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, and we didn't talk about the hospital much at all. We talked about my father, about the 11-bed clinic, about how he used to say the day people start seeing what you've built instead of who you are, that's the day you stop being able to trust anyone in the room. Margaret called the next morning. I let it ring through to voicemail. She called again that afternoon. I let that one go too. I wasn't ready, and I told her so honestly 2 days later when I finally picked up. "I'm not angry," I said again. but I need some time before I can be in a room with you and not feel 30 years of silence sitting between us." She was quiet for a long moment. "I understand," she said. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be here." 3 weeks later, the Scranton Times-Tribune ran the story on its front page. Under a photograph the reporter had actually taken that day, without my noticing me at the east entrance at 5:15 in the morning, badge scanner in hand. The hospital lit up gold behind me in the early dark. The caption read, "He built it. Every morning. He still shows up to guard the door." I kept my post at the east entrance for another 2 months after that, because I wanted to, not because I had to, and because Daniel told me if I quit cold turkey, I'd drive Ruth Ann up a wall within a week, and he wasn't wrong. Eventually, I moved my office into what had been my father's old administrative suite, the one I'd avoided calling mine for 30 years. I hung his stethoscope in a shadow box on the wall across from my desk. No plaque, no explanation. The staff who noticed it never asked, and I never offered. 6 months after that afternoon in the break room, on a Sunday in late spring, my phone rang while I was in the garden behind the house, and it was Margaret. "Dad," she said, her voice careful in a way I hadn't heard from her in years, stripped down to something almost like the girl who used to fall asleep in the waiting room as a kid. "I don't know how to start this conversation." "Start anywhere," I told her. "Can I come by?" she said. "Not to talk about the hospital. I just want to sit in your garden and not talk about anything important, if that's all right." "That's more than all right," I said. "Bring your mother's favorite, the lemon cake, from the bakery on Adams Avenue. She'll pretend she doesn't want any, and then eat half of it." A sound came through the phone that was half a laugh and half something else entirely. "I know, Dad," she said. "I know. I have kept my father's stethoscope on that wall for a reason that has nothing to do with medicine. It reminds me every single day that the most expensive mistake I ever made in 66 years wasn't a bad hire or a bad contract. It was silence. I stayed quiet to protect my children from what money does to people. And my silence built a door that someone else walked straight through, and very nearly took everything 2 generations of us built with our own hands. If you are holding something back from the people you love because you have convinced yourself it protects them, I am asking you to hear this plainly. It does not always protect them. Sometimes it just leaves them standing in a hallway with no map, making decisions they never would have made if you'd simply told them the truth when you had the chance. Say the true thing before someone else gets to use your silence against you first. That is the whole lesson, and I learned it the hard way so that maybe you won't have to.